EU combating anti-Semitism policy, tools, opportunities and limitations. After the rise in anti-Semitic attacks since 7th of October, what are the possibilities and limitations of the EU's policy? Carolyn Dudek will explore. Although anti-Semitism has been on the rise across Europe since 2001, the EU ignored the issue. In 2015, however, the tide seemed to turn when the European Commission, the executive body of the EU, formed a coordinator's office to combat anti-Semitism. In 2021, the office created the first ever strategy to combat anti-Semitism and foster Jewish life. This presentation will examine why and how the EU created a policy focusing on anti-Semitism and some of the policy tools the EU possesses to address anti-Semitism. Although not created distinctly to address anti-Semitism, the EU has other legal underpinnings that provide a framework within which it can address this. After October 7th and the rise of anti-Semitic instances in Europe, it begs the question, what measures, if any, can the EU really implement? We will explore the possibilities and limitations of the EU's policy and its influence on its member states. Carolyn Dudek is Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science and Director of European Studies at Hofstra University in New York. She has written extensively on the EU across various policy sectors. Her current work is focused on EU anti-discrimination policy with a particular focus on anti-Semitism. She is currently writing a monograph about the EU's anti-Semitism policy.
And now I'm very, very happy to introduce Carolyn Dudek from Hofstra University, who's going to speak on EU combating anti-Semitism policy, tools, opportunities and limitations. Carolyn.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for coming. And you also want to say tomorrow's Thanksgiving here in the United States, and I just want to say it's a tradition to say what we're thankful for, and I'm very thankful for all the work that you do, David, and also to the London Center and for putting the issue of anti-Semitism front and center, because it's so very important. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about, to the extent that the European Union is addressing this issue. So I'm going to just do share screen. A second. There we go. And hopefully everybody can see that. So the title of my talk is EU Combating Anti-Semitism Policy, Tools, Opportunities, and Limitations. And this project actually that I'm working on, so this is an ongoing piece of research. I began it in 2020, and I have gotten EU funding actually, and that's part of on this slide here. The European Union has funded some of the research that I'm doing on the EU's anti-Semitism policy. So the fact that they give you money means that it's something that they think is important. So the main questions that I want to focus on today is, why is addressing anti-Semitism important? And I realize for this crowd, maybe this isn't, I don't have to answer this question, but whenever I give this talk at other universities, at my own university, in the classroom, I like to start with this question, because I think it's an important one. Why is anti-Semitism important for the European Union to address? And then I think more for what all of you are interested in is, what tools does the EU have to actually address anti-Semitism, and how are they doing? What are the results so far? And I'll do my best to touch on some of that, keeping in mind this is a moving target, it's an ongoing policy. So to start with my first, the very first question of, why is addressing anti-Semitism important? And I think that the way that I look at it is that anti-Semitism is a threat to democracy. It's not just about Jew hatred. It's about our democratic way of life. And you can, think of it as, and Deborah Lipstadt, the US Special Envoy, talks about this quite often, that anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It's the canary in the coal mine for other forms of hate. And it's also the canary in the coal mine for an erosion of democratic principles, democratic ideals, rule of law. And you can think about it in ways of sort of civil rights, that you can't have discrimination against Jews. That's an undemocratic concept. But the other piece of it is that anti-Semitism undermines the legitimacy of democratic governments. And the way that it happens and the way that anti-Semitism can express itself is in the form of conspiracy theories. So if people believe that Jews control the banks and Jews control the government and Jews control the world, then thinking about, democracy and government, it means that a few people hold all the power. And if people truly believe that, it undermines the legitimacy of governments, and it can also provoke violence. And we have seen that happen. And the other piece of it, of why is anti-Semitism important, is that it is a severe security risk. And we saw this in Amsterdam just over a week ago, of what happened there. So it certainly is a security risk and a real issue for democracy. So the question of, why, oops, it's not letting me, there we go. Why does the European Union care about anti-Semitism? Why is it a problem? And I think it's really important to remember that the European Union itself is an institution that was built upon the ideals of democracy, and it's built upon the ashes of World War II. And the EU leadership will often say that the EU was built upon the ashes of World War II. But you will hear Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, and she was just reinstated for another 5-year term. Her commission was just approved, I believe, today. She has even said that it was not just built upon the ashes of World War II, but out of the ashes of the Shoah and the 6 million that perished. And I think that European leadership at the EU level is quite aware of that. And so I have a speech here from Ursula von der Leyen, who says that our fight against anti-Semitism is more urgent than ever. Anti-Semitism is on the rise across Europe. Anti-Semitism is a poison for our democratic values and an attack on our way of life. And so the EU sees this as a significant problem. There is a policy that has been created around the issue of anti-Semitism. And if you'll just indulge me for a moment, the Council, so in the European Union is a supranational level of government. So you have, of course, your member state governments, but above that, you have all the EU institutions. And the EU institutional structure is organized so that there's representation of the member states, and then there's representation of the EU institutions themselves. So the Commission represents the EU. It is the executive body of the European Union, but we also have something called the Council of the European Union. And the Council of the EU represents the member states. It has a co-legislative function. And when the Council of the EU makes a declaration, it's important. It means that all the member states have gotten together and have decided this is something important and we are going to make a declaration about it. And I realize that sometimes, we think, well, it's just words, but these words, what comes out of it is when the Council says these things, the Commission then needs to act on them. And so there is a link between the words and the actions. And the Council declaration that just came out a month ago, came out in October. I just want to read this piece because I think it's kind of interesting to see where the European Union leadership, how they're thinking about anti-Semitism. So the quote that I pulled out is anti-Semitism. This is a declaration, by the way, just on anti-Semitism. I'm just pulling out one paragraph. Anti-Semitism has been present in Europe for centuries, manifesting itself in different forms and culminating in the Holocaust, which erased Jewish life and heritage in many parts of the continent. Moreover, according to the EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, which will go from 2021 to 2030 of the Commission, contemporary anti-Semitism can be found in radical fringe groups espousing right-wing, left-wing, or Islamic extremism. It can hide behind anti-Zionism. The EU has stated this. It can hide behind anti-Zionism, but it can also be found in the center of society. Anti-Semitism is incompatible with the EU's values and aims. It represents a threat to Jewish people and to Jewish life, as well as to open and diverse societies and the very fabric of the European way of life. The EU stands unequivocally against all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, and discrimination. These phenomena are to be vigorously combated, and the Council calls in the strongest possible terms for further action in this regard. And what I find striking about this quote is that it recognizes that anti-Semitism is coming from the far left, it's coming from the far right, and it's coming from general society. And the point about recognizing that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. Oops, let's see if I can get my screw. Oh, I think I have to do it this way. Oops. There we go. Okay, so I just want to show you some, and some of you have probably seen these measurements before, but these are findings. So the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, or what's called FRA for short, the agency has hired out external, third parties to collect data on how Jewish experiences are in Europe. And the point that I want to make, and you can take a look at this data, and what's interesting to note, the data was pulled in 2018, and it was also pulled again in 2023. The 2023 data ends in June. It does not capture after October 7th at all. These numbers are not great. And what's really important that the EU had these measurements taken is that these measurements have been used to then, the data have been used to then demonstrate that we have a problem in Europe. And it has helped to promote the kinds of policies that have followed. So as you can see, you know, questions like anti-Semitism increased in my country in the last 5 years. In 2018, 88% of people said it had, and 81% in 2023, again, before October 7th. You know, things like experience anti-Semitic harassment in 2023, it's 37%. Encountered anti-Semitism online or offline. 90% of people said they had experienced it online, and 77% said that they experienced it offline. Other questions about, you know, worry for their own safety. 53% of people are saying this. 60% worry for their families. Experience verbal abuse and harassment, 37%. These numbers are horrific. What's key here is the European Union has spent money to collect this data so that it could be compared across member states, and that we have data that's useful to then say there is a problem and to actually create policy. Now, if I showed you anti-Semitic acts between 2022 and 2023, and I'm going to admit I cherry-picked my data. And the reason why I had to cherry pick the data is that many member states do not collect data on anti-Semitism, and they do not do it in a systematic way. So when you look at these figures that I have for you, and I got them from a lot of different sources, you cannot compare across countries. You can only compare within one country. So you can look at Austria between 2022 and 2023. You cannot compare between Austria and France because they measure it differently. And that's problematic because it makes it really hard then to have data that's really usable in creating policy. And one of the things that the European Commission has been pushing member states to do, and this is still in process and in motion, these are the limitations of the EU, is to try to get member states, first of all, to measure anti-Semitism and to measure it so that you can compare across countries, so that you can actually really use this data. But even looking at this data, which isn't great data, but it's data, you know, we can see the huge increase in anti-Semitism just in the past year. And obviously October 7th, and by the way, if you dig into the data, most of the number of events that happen is after October 7th. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, what is the EU policy? I mentioned, you know, they've done some data collection, but let's talk about the policy itself and kind of where it came from. because we can talk about the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, starting in the 21st century. So, really starting in 2000, following the conference in Durban, after 9/11 and the conspiracy theories that come out of that. But the EU does not get engaged in addressing anti-Semitism. And we're really going to see the EU engage in anti-Semitism policy as something separate than just racism, xenophobia, because that's how the EU dealt with it before. They kind of lumped it in with every other kind of hatred. And in 2015, there are a couple events that raise the attention of the leadership within the European Union. And those two events, and you're probably all familiar with this, was the attack at the kosher supermarket following the attack on Charlie Hebdo, where there was murder took place at the kosher supermarket, and that was done purposefully. And then just a month later in Copenhagen is, again, another violent attack outside of a synagogue, which results in the murder of two people. And these are two very visible events, and they were close together, and they were in two different member states. And so as a result of that, Frans Timmermans, who was he was a commissioner at the time, so in the executive body, and he held the responsibility for fulfilling what's called the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So all the kinds of rights that Europeans have. Timmermans was a very powerful member of the commission. I mean, there's a lot of writings about the Juncker Commission, and nothing could get done without Timmermans' approval. Well, Timmermans, after these events happened, decided that he would run a colloquium on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So that occurred in the fall following these attacks. And it's at that colloquium that the decision is taken on the part of the EU to create an office called the Coordinator to Combat Anti-Semitism. And by the way, there's also a coordinator's office at the same time that's created to address anti-Muslim hate. So what is created is an office within the executive of the European Union. As the Commission is moving forward on its work in addressing anti-Semitism, the Commission is one of the first institutions to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And throughout that year, from 2016 and 2017, the various institutions of the EU begin to adopt that definition. Why is that important? That definition, I think, is very helpful in formulating policy. It gives different examples of how anti-Semitism can express itself because it's a shapeshifter. And so it provides an opportunity then for the creation of policy, because if you can define what you're dealing with, you can create policy around it. In 2018, the Council, so again, this represents the member states, make a declaration to address anti-Semitism. In that declaration, they call for member states to create national strategies. They don't do it in 2018, but the words are out there, the declaration is out there. 2 years later, when Germany holds the presidency of the European Union, this is a rotating presidency that's held by a country, so it's not an accident that Germany's holding it at the time, and they push to have a declaration to what we call mainstreaming anti-Semitism. What mainstreaming is that you take a concept like anti-Semitism and you try to include it in various policy areas. So it could be in areas of foreign policy. It could be in somewhere perhaps in the free market. It could be in digital services. So there's different ways in which anti-Semitism could be included across different policy areas. And this is something that the EU has done. For example, gender was the first thing that they ever did this with. So it's a way to include a policy area, a policy concept across many policy areas. So that is put into place then in 2020. And then 2021 is really the big event. And that is the creation of what is called the Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism and Foster Jewish Life. And what's interesting about the title of it is that Ursula von der Leyen, when she became the commission president in December of 2020, she gave one of her first speeches that she gave was after the attack at the synagogue in Halle, Germany. And she announces that the commission is going to work on this strategy. And she's the one who adds and foster Jewish life. And it's a really interesting component that she puts in there. And, you know, when I talk to Jewish organizations, one of the comments that they make about the strategy, what they really like about the strategy is that, yes, the memorialization of the Holocaust is important, but we're a living, breathing community that wants to try to live in Europe, and we need help in fostering Jewish life. And so, you know, that's an interesting piece of this policy. I don't know of any other EU policy that kind of has that verbiage in it. Now that we have this policy, right, this strategy, and the thing you have to keep in mind about the European Union is that there are certain things that the European Union can do, but the European Union is always limited by sovereignty. Member states maintain sovereignty in certain areas. But the one thing I want to point out is that European Union law is supreme to national law. And those are the places where the EU can actually push forward on these kinds of policies addressing anti-Semitism. So in the work that I've been doing, I kind of divide out the mechanisms that the European Union has. So the European Union has what we call soft law. So, you know, when we talk about soft law, it refers to things like recommendations or, you know, voluntary agreements, benchmarking, maybe a little peer pressure amongst the member states, creating networks across European countries. So that's, you know, what soft law means. Hard law is when we're talking about things that are binding upon member states and that they can be invoked in court as standards for review. So this has a little more legal teeth to it. So here, soft law, we have the mainstreaming that I just mentioned earlier. The strategy itself could be considered a type of soft law. And then, of course, the national strategies that came out of the EU's overall strategy. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, that's soft law. And then something called the Online Code of Conduct, which I'll come back to, but that's an attempt to regulate the internet in a voluntary way. And then in hard law, we have the EU treaties themselves. So the European Union does not have a constitution. It's a series of treaties. And within, for example, the Amsterdam Treaty of 1999, in that treaty, Article 13 specifically states that there are certain protected characteristics, and they list out religion, race, ethnicity, any of those things that would cover Jews and anti-Semitism. We also have the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which I mentioned to you, which are certain civil rights that Europeans have. Again, those kind of protected categories are written into the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So those categories are protected. Jews, whether you define it as a religion, an ethnicity, are covered legally within those documents. I'll talk a little bit about Council framework decisions, which are binding decisions on member states, and I'm going to come back to those. Infringement. So infringement is a legal mechanism that the Commission, so the executive body, has to make member states comply with Council framework decisions. And so there's a legal mechanism there to make sure that member states are following EU law. And then there's something called the Digital Services Act, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is a regulation to regulate digital platforms. And I'll come back to that one as well. So the strategy to combat anti-Semitism and foster Jewish life, it has three basic pillars. This is all very sort of broad, right? But there's three pillars. So the first one is preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, protecting and fostering Jewish life in the EU, and education, research, and Holocaust remembrance. So out of the strategy, and one of the things, when you talk to the leadership in the EU that were involved in creating the strategy, the big thing that they tried to do was to, in each one of these pillars, that each item is something that is actionable. It's not just conceptual, they're actionable. So if you look at some of the things that the EU has done, particularly, right after October 7th, the European Union, through the Commission, allocated 5 million euro towards the security of Jewish sites across Europe as they were seeing what was happening. And I should note that member states also followed suit, adding to that money to provide greater security for Jewish sites. The EU has been funding many projects to address anti-Semitism. So oftentimes what the EU will do is to give money to non-governmental organizations to carry out a lot of this work. And they're probably better equipped to do so anyways. So for example, there's an organization, a non-governmental organization that has a program called Networks Overcoming Anti-Semitism, or NOAA. And they do a lot of training of educators, public officials, people in different walks of life, to train them about what is anti-Semitism, how do you address it, how do you deal with it. The European Union has contributed money and is working on a project with UNESCO, educating K through 12 teachers all across Europe. There was a program that went into place. It was more of a pilot program. I'm sure they're going to have to come back to this one. It was called Change the Chance. And it was a program. They worked with a couple football teams in Germany, and to get the footballers and the fans to learn about anti-Semitism, to actually visit Holocaust sites, and to try to, embed this fight against anti-Semitism within the footballing world. And we know that this is not, what happened a week and a half ago is not the first time that this has happened. Obviously, this was much more violent, but anti-Semitism has been in that football hooliganism community for quite a while. There are other things, for example, the Citizens Equality Rights and Values Program, that has approximately 11 million euro that goes into it to provide all kinds of resources for civil society kinds of groups. The EU has also contributed 26 million euro, and that was over the period of 2010 to 2025. So it's going to be ending soon, sort of. What the EU has tried to create is what is called the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. And this is a project, and it's a global project. And in January of 25, it will become a permanent organization. And the other thing that the EU is trying to do is to create a research hub on anti-Semitism and on Jewish life and Jewish history in Europe. And they're putting money towards that program. They have a Young Ambassadors program for Holocaust remembrance. There is money for Holocaust sites to network with one another and to preserve those sites and to make them known to people. And the other piece that's really interesting is that the EU has given money to the European Union Student Union, which is an organization of European college students, university students, who have done some amazing work addressing anti-Semitism. They're at the forefront of it. And I think it's one of the only sort of youth organizations that the EU funds. And they've done some pretty amazing stuff with what they have been given. They're actually in the middle of a lawsuit against Twitter, when it was formerly Twitter, about their not complying with their anti-Semitism policy. So that's one of the places that the money has gone to. I think another thing that I'd like to point out is that the Commission has worked with the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training. It's called CEPOL. And they have been working with both Europol and other policing forces to explain how to identify anti-Semitism so that, when there's an anti-Semitic act, that it is treated as such. And they also work with judges so that something that is anti-Semitic is adjudicated as such, because that means the penalty is much higher. It's a hate crime. The other thing that I'll say about the EU strategy, because I'm sitting in the United States, the EU strategy ended up being copied by the US. And part of the reason why that occurred was that a lot of the non-governmental organizations that were working at the EU, with the European Union to create the strategy were also working in the United States at the same time. But you also had a close relationship between the European Union's anti-Semitism envoy working with the US anti-Semitism envoy, Deborah Lipstadt. So the two of them working together, sharing much of their information, the policy itself. And by the way, if you look at the two policies, they're very, very similar. And so creating that relationship, having the EU strategy, having the US create a similar strategy. And now, by the way, there is something called the Global Guidelines for Countering Anti-Semitism that the US actually wrote, but it's intended to be an international document, and many countries are signing on to this. And again, you can say this is words and niceties, but you have to start somewhere. So I think that the EU strategy has had a knock-on effect outside of just the EU. And a really concrete example of this is what happened in Kyrgyzstan. So in Kyrgyzstan, there was a Jewish day school that had been renovated, and the government was going to expropriate it. And when the EU envoy found out about this, Katarina von Schnorbein, who's the coordinator for the EU, contacted her counterpart in Kyrgyzstan. The ambassador there contacted the United States, and with pressure from the US and the EU embassies or delegations, in the case of the EU, they were able to get the government to step back from taking over the one Jewish school that they have in Kyrgyzstan. So there are some positive outcomes. I also mentioned, so in the EU strategy, there's also national strategies that came out of it. So in the EU strategy, it states that member countries are to create their own national strategies or incorporate anti-Semitism within their legal framework, within whatever their governmental structure is. So the outcome of that, this comes out of a report that was done in August. I don't think anything has changed on this. So 23 members have established some kind of a strategy. 14 member states have created standalone strategies. 20 member states have appointed special envoys, and 25 member states have adopted the IHRA definition. Again, the EU strategy recommends, and really, and a very strong recommendation for member states to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because with that kind of definition, you can actually create policy. If you were to say, some of the outcomes, some interesting things that have developed. So, for example, in Austria, they've actually passed legislation to expand the 1947 Nazi Prohibition Act to include displays of Hamas and Hezbollah imagery. In the Netherlands, after what just happened with the football match a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago, the Netherlands redid their national strategy. They just came out with it the other day. They're contributing €4.5 million dedicated to anti-Semitism, increasing funding for security, and pushing for education in the schools about anti-Semitism. And another piece of this is that they also are requiring that new immigrants have to demonstrate a knowledge of the Holocaust, and there will be specific questions put into the citizenship test about anti-Semitism. And they've also dedicated January to Holocaust Education Month. Now, Holocaust Education Month, it's a nicety, it's one of those, it's a lot of words, but you have to start somewhere. And if they can start putting things into the schools, it can have, a knock-on effect. So those are soft law tools. If I can talk about some hard law tools, and this one I think is really interesting. It's called the 2008 Council Framework Decision. And if I can just read you, this is like a short version of it on the screen, but I'm going to read you the full version so you can see the significance of it. So the 2008 Council Framework states that each member state shall take the measures necessary to ensure that the following intentional conduct is punishable. So the first thing is publicly inciting to violence or hatred directed against a group or persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin. So Jew, however you want to define it, can be covered under that. The commission of an act referred to in point A, so what I just read to you, by public dissemination or distribution of tracts, pictures, or other material. And here's the other piece that is really directly related to anti-Semitism. Publicly condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin, when the conduct is carried out in a manner likely to incite to violence or hatred against such a group or a member of such a group. So what does that mean? It means the Holocaust. That's really what they're referencing in that 2008 framework. And one of the things that, if we talk about, well, what's the impact of this council framework? So let me explain. With the council framework, the EU says you have to, member states, put this into your national legislation. You need to meet these goals that are laid out in the 2008 framework. You can do it how you want to, but you have to achieve these goals. And what happened was a lot of member states didn't transpose the 2008 framework into their own legislation. And so one of the mechanisms that the EU has is infringement, which I mentioned to you earlier. And initially, the EU did nothing about this. There was no infringement procedure. In 2014, there's another report written. Many countries are still in violation. They're not fulfilling their obligation of the 2008 Council framework. And then 2020 happens, and the death of George Floyd. And not only in the United States was there a reckoning about race, but there was a reckoning in the European Union. And there's a famous speech that Ursula von der Leyen gave before the European Parliament. And in that speech, they create a new strategy that the Commission was going to do to address racism across Europe. And as part of that, in that new strategy to address racism, it specifically states that if countries don't adopt the Council framework and don't implement it in their member states, that the Commission will begin infringement proceedings, which is a formal proceeding that eventually you start out with sort of notes going back and forth between the Commission and the member state to get the member state to comply. And then eventually, if the member state doesn't comply, it can go to the European Court of Justice. So what happened in the case of this particular strategy that came out, it came out in August, and by September of 2020, infringement proceedings begin across several countries. And so today, if you look at the infringement, there were 13 infringement cases that have been started. 6 member states now are in full compliance, and the other member states, again, it's like this back and forth of letter writing between the Commission and the member state to make sure that member states are working in a direction to achieve the goals of the Council framework. I don't know if many of you have been following, but in Lithuania, there has been this new government. So they had elections. They're trying to create a new coalition. And as part of that coalition, one of the mainstream parties is probably going to bring in a party called the Dawn of the River Neman, which is a far-right anti-Semitic party. And the leader of that party, Zematitis, has made anti-Semitic comments and is currently under criminal procedure against those comments that he has made. The reason why he is under a criminal court hearing right now is because of the 2008 framework. And if you look here, so these are the infringement cases that went through. You got to dig for this information. It's not easy to get this. But if you look at Lithuania, case closed, they hadn't fully implemented the 2008 framework, which means that the issue of anti-Semitism had not been something that was illegal or criminal. Well, now it is because of the EU, and now the leader of the Dawn of the River Party is now under a criminal court case. And here you can also see, again, Lithuania regarding infringement for trivialization, denial of the Holocaust. Lithuania, again, was one of those countries that was in non-compliance, but in 2021, the case closed, meaning that they had created legislation to address it. So you can see some of the, who are the bad actors, who are the ones that are missing off the list. But this is a list of those countries that have gone through the infringement proceedings. The EU doesn't like to talk about who's who and who's under infringement and who's not. But you can find the data, and here it is with a little digging. They don't want to embarrass the member states. That's why they don't make it so public. One of the really interesting tools, so the 2008 framework, I think it has some teeth to it. We'll see what happens with these other infringement cases, because I know you're thinking only 6 were achieved and there were 13 out there. So we'll see what happens with these other infringement cases. The other thing that I want to mention that is really important, I think, and innovative about the European Union is how they're trying to address online hatred and, for our interests, anti-Semitism, which we know has exploded online and is incredibly problematic. So what the European Union has done, before we get to the Digital Services Act, which went into effect in 2022, the EU started out with something called the Code of Conduct. And this is what I put into the soft policy part of my graphic, which actually it's kind of moving into the hard law piece, because now they're including the Code of Conduct within the Digital Services Act. So it'll have a little more teeth than it does now. The Code of Conduct actually was created in 2016. It also came out of that colloquium that I mentioned about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. The Code of Conduct is a completely voluntary program that platforms, and when this started, it was the larger platforms, so like Twitter and Facebook were part of this, that they could volunteer, and there would be what are called trusted flaggers. So these are third parties that are trained to spot anti-Semitism or racism or anti-Muslim hate, whatever. They're trained to actually find these things and to report them. And so if a trusted flagger flags something, the company is supposed to take it very seriously, investigate it, and then take it down, obviously, if it is in violation of EU law or national laws. So the way that this works is that then the EU every 6 months will publish what type of hate speech has been found online and how well did companies comply. So it'll give data on exactly how long it took for these companies to take down posts. So it's a little bit of shaming to get these companies to take down this kind of content. But the Code of Conduct, again, it's voluntary. It only involved a few companies. And it's what we call a content-based approach. So it looks at anti-Semitism or hate speech and pulls it down by each time you see it. And we know it's like an ocean out there on the internet and on these social media platforms. So the Digital Services Act, what it does is it moves from what we call content-based, which is what the Code of Conduct is about, and looking at more of a systems-based approach. And what I mean by that is the Digital Services Act requires companies to disclose their algorithms, which of course these companies never want to do. I do want to note that the Digital Services Act, the way that it regulates the social platforms, the way that it regulates these social platforms is that there is, first of all, the commission itself has its own regulating body overseeing this. The larger platforms have to have at least 45 million users. The Digital Services Act right now only applies to those large platforms. So the smaller platforms are not included. So we talk about, where is the EU missing out on regulating the internet or social media platforms? This is a piece of it. This is only relevant to large platforms, which is the way that they define it is 45 million users. So the EU, the Commission, has a regulating body. Each member state is to create a regulating body as well. And these companies are also to hire out a third party that will also oversee what they are doing. And as part of the way the Digital Services Act works, it also means that the 2008 framework that I just explained to you is part of it, because the 2008 framework is part of EU law. That means it's part of the Digital Services Act. So a big component of the DSA is to try to find and take down and deal with the question of hate speech online. And one of the interesting things about the DSA is it actually does have teeth. If a company does not comply, the fine is 6% of their global revenue. So it's actually like a relatively significant amount of money from what things had been before. And right now, for example, there are formal proceedings that are happening against X, and all of you, I'm sure, remember this. After October 7th, on X, there was a whole slew of misinformation using video game imaging and saying that it was Israel doing this, and misleading content and allowing it to be on their platform. So the commission actually had written a letter to Elon Musk directly, and this is in now a proceeding within the EU. And we'll see what happens. This is going to be a very interesting test case to see how this outcome will be. I honestly, I don't know. This is the first time that we're watching this. One of the interesting things too that I want to mention about the DSA and why I think it's powerful is that if you are sitting in Europe and you see anti-Semitic content online, and let's say that anti-Semitic comment came from the United States, but you're sitting in France, it doesn't matter because you're in France and you're being affected by it. That platform, if it's one of these larger platforms, must take it down. So it has some interesting ramifications here. One of the things to kind of keep in mind for those of you who are not living in the European Union, when you go on a website and you have that box that pops up and it says, are you accepting cookies or not accepting cookies? And you usually just like click it and get it out of your way, right? You're just like, what is this nuisance? Why is this here? It's because of the European Union. The European Union, under their one of the digital privacy acts that they have, required platforms to do that. And what platforms found is that it's too hard to have one platform for Europe and another platform for the rest of the world. And so as these platforms are deciding, how are they going to now move in this new space, the Digital Services Act, what some may end up doing is just following the DSA, even if they're functioning in the United States or functioning in Asia or other parts of the world, because they don't want the cost of creating different platforms for different spaces. So I think there's a strong possibility for the DSA to have a very interesting knock-on effect to other parts of the globe when we talk about, regulating social media and regulating other spaces. So I'd like to conclude so that we can leave some time for questions and discussion, but I think for me, the takeaway is that what the EU is doing, what the EU strategy is, I think it's a serious policy. And I think that there are real instruments to try to address anti-Semitism. However, I think the biggest limitation here is how effective the policy can be within member states, because it's really up to the member states to enforce many of the mechanisms that have been created at the EU level. And, you know, if member states are unwilling to really fulfill their national strategies, then it just becomes words and it doesn't become action. So there's a lot more to do. This, I think, is a serious start to address anti-Semitism, which is a threat not only to Jews, but this is a threat to democracy, which is the underlying principle of the European Union itself. So I'm going to stop share.
That was really, really interesting, I think, and a really clear and lovely kind of introduction to a whole range of policies and practices. Just set out really, really nicely and clearly. So I will invite people to respond and to ask questions and to participate with pleasure. While I'm doing that, I will go straight to Amy.
Thank
Amy,
you.
please.
Carolyn, thank you for a very concise and interesting presentation. You concluded by stating that how effective the EU would be depends largely on the member states. And in order to get away from just the rhetoric into the reality of providing protection, you asked us to place some faith in, for example, council decisions. I haven't really heard many people previous to your presentation focus on those decisions as if they're hard law. I would suggest, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, that if the EU took anti-Semitism very seriously, it would move not from a basis of having a decision, but what we'd say are directives or regulations. As you well know, the decision is one of the least, with the exception of a recommendation. It has the least force. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as you laid it out. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think even that 2008 framework, it was not easy to get that passed. It was really hard to get that passed. And when you think back, 2008, you didn't have as many far right parties in power. I mean, there's a reason why it passed when it did. If that were to come up today, I don't know if that particular council framework, the 2008 one, would be approved. And I think, because it's the council, because it's the member states, it's very hard to get to that threshold. You're absolutely right. Like, you can't get to that threshold of enough countries to actually create a directive or a regulation. But I think that, when you start talking about anti-discrimination, you're moving into an area of the EU that has not traditionally been the purview of the European Union. And I would, I make the argument that, the EU starts with mostly the free market, right? It's all about goods being sold, free movement of people, and that's where the EU starts. And now we see this sort of like creeping of getting the EU to engage in other policy areas outside of that. And to your comment about, well, why isn't the EU just creating a law? By the way, the Commission, and they started talking about this in 2020, I think it was, and I've been seeing it again, the desire to create something called EU crimes, EU hate crimes. And by doing that, what the Commission would like to try to do is to pass something that would be like the 2008 framework, but in a hard law setting. So transposition doesn't have to happen. It would just be law. So there is a move on the part of inside the commission, at least. Now, can we get member states to sign on? I don't know. And of course, you don't need unanimity either. So, it depends on like which countries they could get to sign on to it. But there is a movement within the commission to try to make these crimes what they're terming as EU crimes. So there is a move in that direction. We're not there yet, but there has been discussion about it.
Who else would like to come in? And I wanted to mention there was a question in the chat box about data. Is there data on why the increase of anti-Semitism prior to the 7th of October?
Data on why the increase?
Yeah,
There's data, yeah.
What happened? What happened, and how do you understand it?
So there is data on the increase. Again, the data by country is a little tricky. Some countries are just better at it and actually did it. If you go to the Fundamental Rights Agency webpage, you can actually download the studies that they have done. So there are some EU studies, but they kind of depend a little bit on like how well the member states have done. But if you look at the data, there definitely has been an increase. And if you were to ask the question, why the increase, David's probably more of an expert on this than I am, but you could start with the Durban Conference. And that sort of begins to see this like anti-Zionism movement globally, not just in Europe, but in other places. You have 9/11, which I mentioned at the start, that, these conspiracy theories that Jews planned it and they left the building and, all of that. And there was a very popular book that went around Europe that people bought and read and, believe this conspiracy. And then if you keep thinking about, so what other events have happened? You have, the attack, in Toulouse, you have the attack of Iliolimi. You have, all of these things that are mounting in Europe, but it doesn't grab, the bizarre thing, like the Toulouse shooting. In the media, and Kenneth Marcus writes about this, that like there was no discussion about anti-Semitism as being the rationale, right? It was all about, well, it's extremism, it's, but not about anti-Semitism. So this was growing in Europe. And this is a thing actually really interesting. In 2003, the EU tries to do a study on the rise of anti-Semitism, and they contracted out to a German, a Berlin base. And you know the story of this, right? And they buried the report. But when the report finally comes out, it's very clear in that report. And look, the declaration that the council now is saying is it's coming from the left, it's coming from the right, and here's the piece they wanted to bury. It's coming from extremists, Islamic extremists. And, so we know that also the immigration process that has happened in Europe, unfortunately has also increased the amount of anti-Semitism as you have Muslim extremism. Not, I don't want to say all Muslims, but, Muslim extremism has contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism. And then, anytime anything happens in Israel, we see an increase in anti-Semitic acts in Europe. I mean, even before October 7th, every time there was a something, the numbers would spike up. So, and then COVID. I mean, COVID was this strange moment of the conspiracies that Jews created COVID, the Holocaust, trivialization of protesters in Germany and other countries saying, lockdown is like we're in a concentration camp. So, anti-Semitism expressing itself through a lot of crises. And like some of my writing, I really focus on crises in Europe. And there's literature in EU studies, and it's called crisification, that there's so many crises that have happened, the migrant crisis, the Great Recession. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories, the Jews caused the Great Recession and caused the Euro crisis. So there's a lot of reasons as to why there has been this gradual increase in the 21st century. And unfortunately, October 7th was like this tipping point. We think it's a tipping point.
while we're waiting for people to formulate their comments and questions, I want to ask about the kind of gulf between the kind of rational policy initiatives that you were talking about, which they all feel a bit kind of like, the machine does what it can and it intervenes here and it intervenes there, and then the kind of, it feels like there's such a disjunction between that and the kind of crazy whirl of conspiracy fantasy and populism and racism and anti-Semitism and the sort of coarsening of the political discourse and the polarization. And I always kind of wonder that what we can expect of kind of any governments and administrators and people in authority, what can we expect of them when there is no consensus about, for example, what constitutes anti-Semitism and what doesn't, and that when there's more polarization than consensus about whether anti-Semitism is even significant. So what is it can we expect from, especially the EU, which kind of is founded on consensus, right? That you can't do anything radical or in the EU because first there has to be consensus between every member state, more or less. Not precisely, but and within member states there's no consensus. So just a question about that disjunction between the kind of whirl of anti-Semitic discourse on the one hand, and then the kind of rational levers that people in various kinds of authority have to pull.
Yeah, and I think, to point out the problem, right? I think we are living in a moment where, we have all these populist movements that are emerging. And again, populism, includes those sort of conspiracy theories. It creates this deeper polarization. I'll be very curious to see what's going to happen with the new European Parliament, that we have, a European Parliament with more members on the far right. And the far right is very odd because, you have a Viktor Orban who says, I support Israel. And then he says, well, look at Alex Soros and he's working with Ursula von der Leyen, and, these sort of strange things that happen. And unfortunately, and this is sort of how I think about anti-Semitism through like my political science lens, if you will, is that it's become a political tool for these political leaders. And I think, one of the things at the EU level, when you're talking like within the Commission, I don't want to say these institutions are apolitical. They're always political, but there's something about these Eurocrats that, an Ursula von der Leyen type styled person, and the fact that she's German, I think it matters. I think it matters that she's at the helm, to be perfectly honest. I don't know if somebody else became the president of the Commission, that these things would be moving forward the way that they are right now. But I think that, at the EU level, it takes out some of the politics that you're going to see at the national level. But you're right to say, like, the national governments, there has to be some kind of consensus. But I think there is something to be said about the argument of how anti-Semitism undermines everything the EU has done, everything that democracy is about. The EU recognizes it. Lars Rensman writes about, how, Jews are seen as a sort of cosmopolitan concept. Well, that's what the EU is. It's about globalization. It's about cosmopolitanism. So if you're, anti-Semitic, then you're just, you're also going to be against the EU. It's problematic for the European Union. They recognize that. They know it. So, yes, there is this like the nice, like very neat pieces of legislation. You're right. But we still have to work in this kind of crazy polarized world, but at least there's something out there to do the boring, policy making, plodding along to try to deal with these kinds of issues.
Just to abuse my position a little more, it's a really interesting point, I think, about the idea of anti-Semitism being, in a sense, directed at the sort of cosmopolitanism of the European Union.
Yeah.
And of course, there's lots and lots of politics all across Europe, and especially in Britain, which is dissatisfied with that aspect of the EU. But I mean, I was reading the Stockholm Declaration, which is like the founding document of IRA.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such an interesting document. And in fact, in some senses, politically, it's a very radical document, because as far as I can understand, it says that Holocaust research and remembrance and commemoration and education about the Holocaust is foundational to democracy in a world where the Shoah has happened. End. So it's a hugely kind of radical statement. And of course, even more so in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like one is more aware of that in Germany. One was it the Germany deputy chancellor said, he said that the raison d'etre of the German state is to protect Israel, which was also, I mean, incredibly kind of radical and
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And then of course, everybody who wants to embrace any diverse kind of anti-Semitism has to begin by undermining this radical claim of the Stockholm Declaration that understanding and remembering and educating about the Holocaust is foundational to civilization in a world where the Shoah has happened.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about, whenever I kind of give this talk and EU scholars are like, well, if the EU can't deal with this, what are they good for? Like, what is the purpose of the European Union if they can't deal with a fundamental, I mean, this is Europe we're talking about,
Well,
right?
wasn't it iron, steel, and coal?
Yeah, exactly. It was supposed to be Iron Suit, but really, if you think about it, nobody's going to die for the euro. They die for ideas, right? I mean, so there is something to be said that like it's imperative for the EU to deal with this issue. And actually, the IRA definition, and you well know this, comes out of the EUMC, the European Union Monitoring Commission, which is the predecessor to the Fundamental Rights Agency. So you had all these European, people from non-governmental, governmental working together to create this definition. It's created in 2005, I think, and then they remove it, from the webpage, and then they pretend like we never created it, and it shows up as the IRA definition. So there's an interesting, like nobody has just quite explained to me what happened, like what's the there. I don't understand what happened. It's a European Union document, came out of the EU to start with. So for the EU to say everybody should adopt the IRA definition, well, yeah, you guys wrote it basically. And it is Europe. Like it shouldn't be lost on anyone that what we're seeing now happened in Europe and what happened in the 20th century in Europe.
I mean, I think that story about IRA is so interesting because the Jewish NGOs came out of Durban in 2001 and were quite shocked, actually, I think, by the way that the kind of the global South, really, or the people who took it upon themselves to speak with the voice of the global South, in some significant way, began to embrace anti-Semitism. And then the Jewish NGOs thought, well, where can we get a hearing? And they went to the EU and to the OSCE, and in fact, they went into the kind of white states, and the whole sort of this kind of came out of Durban, and it was also a real polarization globally. And I mean, now I'm thinking about it, maybe less of an actual global polarization and more of a polarization in thinking, in the people who think that they represent the global South, That was a question.
Is that a question or a statement? I don't know. But I think this sort of, I mean, we've talked about this like in other settings, this whole idea of the oppressed and the oppressor, right? That comes out of sort of how people think about, Israel's a colonial state. I mean, these kinds of things that come out, linking, misunderstanding, not understanding the history of Israel, the foundation of the state. Um, and this kind of like it's black and white, it's one against the other, which has come out of the global South, a very sort of Marxist, if you will, informed idea of how we understand the creation of the state of Israel, and then the idea of blaming Jews for what Israel does as well, which is very blatantly anti-Semitic. So I think these are the kinds of issues that in the international arena the EU has to address. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm kind of looking into is UNRWA and how the EU, at times the European Parliament has held up funding to UNRWA when the report came out from Impact Say demonstrating the use of anti-Semitic material in children's textbooks. And there have been times where the Parliament held it up. And then, of course, politics pushed it back in, and the Parliament said, okay, fine, we'll allow it. But there have been moments where the Parliament said, well, wait a second, what's going on here? I think after October 7th, that sort of reemerged, and then you have certain member states that are like, no, we don't want to support Israel, and other member states that do. So I think that how this translates into international affairs and international relations is like a whole other issue about different in some level than like the internal dynamics that we're talking about, sort of internal within Europe. So one sort of international relations and the other one is sort of internally within Europe and how those play out.
Still hopeful that people will engage, but also not hopeful because I can monopolize your time myself quite happily. And I wanted to ask about you mentioned this way of expressing the concern of the EU being as kind of two related topics, right? The combating of anti-Semitism on the one hand, but also the preservation. Is it the preservation of Jewish life in Europe? Is that the
fostering? It's an interesting choice of words. Fostering Jewish life. And like I said, I don't know any other policy that uses that terminology. Fostering.
So fostering is less alarming, like preserving kind of admits that it might not be preserved, and fostering doesn't quite, but it actually does. I mean, my assumption with that was that somebody kind of jumped up at some point and said, well, there's more to Jewish life in Europe than anti-Semitism, and you have to talk about the positive aspects of Jewish life and all of that kind of thing that we see quite often, which always seems to me a little bit beside the point in the sense that you don't combat anti-Semitism by talking about how brilliant Jews are and how wonderful Jewish life is, but on the other hand, it does raise the question, and people, especially in North America, will ask, and in Israel will ask, is there a future for Jewish life in Europe? And so perhaps the EU is addressing that, and just the fact that it is addressing it is already quite alarming, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and you hear speeches, Ursula von der Leyen, Katharina von Schnorbein, the coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, you'll hear them make those kinds of statements about, the challenges that Jews are facing in Europe. I think there is a fear that like all the Jews are going to leave. I really do believe, like, it seems to be they are fearful. They realize, I think there's a recognition that life has become very hard for Jews in Europe. And so they're trying to do these kinds of programs that say, look at the arts and cultural contribution of the Jews, look at all so that the other piece of it, and I know, like, it sounds a little corny to say, like, oh, if you tell people these famous people were Jewish, they'll be less anti-Semitic. But there's something to be said for saying, European society and culture and philosophy is based on, a lot of Jews were involved in it, that they're part of Europe rather than being seen as outsiders in Europe. Jews are a part of European history. They are part of European society, rather than being being treated as an outsider. And I think that's what the EU is trying to do with some of this programming, is to make it that Jews have, basically always been in Europe, at least since we were exiled from Israel, which we need to point out to people, which is something you have to point out. But, I think that's a piece that the European Union does want to preserve and to make known, to the non-Jewish community that Jews are a part of the society. Jews have always been an important contributor to the society and the culture and all of the things that we think of that makes Europe, Europe.
One hears that in French discourse too, right? That Macron will say things like the Republic wouldn't be the Republic if there had not been French Jews, and also actually some understanding that the Republic itself would not really exist, at least in the way it exists, without French Jews. And on the one hand, like I say, it reminds me of the Stockholm Declaration. It's kind of like really radical claims, but claims that you don't think you don't hear the governments defending them very often, those claims. They're kind of, and also in quite a self-serving way, actually. And I should have a private conversation with you about the Horizon bid and the money for the cross EU hub.
Oh yeah.
For the study of antisemitism. Can you say anything more about that? And
so I can just tell you about so the hub, the way I understand it is it does not have a physical headquarters. So I think it's supposed to be like, in space, I guess, out there. But my understanding, so they did a study, I want to say about a year ago, about what research is being done about Jewish society, Jewish culture, anti-Semitism. And basically what they found is there's more research on anti-Semitism than anything else. And so they wanted to increase research on like all things Jewish, not just anti-Semitism, but also these cultural and philosophical bits. And to try to sort of, use EU monies in ways to promote that. So I'm not a Holocaust scholar, but this new Holocaust Center that's supposed to be global. And by the way, I noticed that the US Holocaust Museum is doing something similar. So I think that there's like a working with the EU also on this program, is sort of my understanding from what I was reading from the Holocaust Museum as well, the US Holocaust Museum. There is a lot of funding available under the Horizons program, under the SERVE program. So I have an Erasmus. I didn't want to say like, oh, this is what I have, but I have an Erasmus Jean Monnet chair. And the way that I wrote that proposal was this anti-Semitism project is the centerpiece of that proposal. And so the overall thing for mine is anti-discrimination in the EU, but the main piece of it is the work on anti-Semitism. So, and I was able to get the grant. So I think, grants are not just about how well you write the grant, but is it something they're interested in? And I think, this was something they were willing to spend money on. So I think, and look, they spent money on the European Union of Jewish Students. And again, they're one of the few youth organizations. I think they're the only one, or maybe one out of two, that got EU funding. And for those of you on the call, like, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they've done some really interesting things to really make public, particularly after this year. They had like a portal you could send in if you had experienced anti-Semitism on campus, and they collected the data. So they had data to share with the European Union about what college life was like on these European campuses. They have this really interesting case. They used legal help from Hate Aid, which is a nonprofit organization. And basically what they're doing is really clever. X has like protections for users, and one of them is to protect you against like hate and anti-Semitism, like, I don't know if anti-Semitism is actually listed, but hate and so on. And basically what the student said is like, there's anti-Semitic content, we flagged it, you didn't take it down, and you're violating my rights as a user because your platform says these are protections that you provide, you haven't fulfilled them. So they're working with this organization, Hate Aid, and there's actually a case against X. I don't know what's going to happen because the last I heard, X has a lot of good lawyers. But kudos to this, these young students to, come up with this and really push it forward. So the EU is funding that organization.
I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm a real outlier on that stuff because I don't know that I want X and Meta and TikTok to be regulating the public sphere and telling me what I'm allowed to post and what I'm not allowed to post. I mean, my one experience of having been put into Facebook jail was when the algorithm, presumably the algorithm, misrecognized something that I'd written and accused me of anti-Semitism. So I'm not at all comfortable with that, actually. And I'm a bit torn to it. Like, I think there's a tendency for people to I don't know, look at anything new, any kind of new media. Like, I bet you anything you like that when books were first printed, people were saying, oh, books are really a terrible problem, and people are going to start reading things that are not the Bible and publishing all kinds of things, and it's going to be the end of civilization as we know it. And so there's a real kind of fear about the new. And on the other hand, though, it's true that my Twitter feed is full of Elon Musk, and I kind of wonder why. And it's more and more full of discourse about migration and quite unpleasant stuff. But I wonder if you could say something about the algorithms. And, is it true that do the algorithms presumably boost me as well as boosting the bad guys, or do they not?
So I'm not a digital expert, but I think that, to your commentary about, well, books and, if I can use a US Supreme Court, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? So, and something like pornography, it when you see it. Like, there are certain things that are hate speech, right? There's a difference between critiquing something and inciting people to violence. And I think, that's the piece that's problematic online. To me, that's the piece that needs to be regulated. It's the inciting violence. It's, spreading some of these conspiracy theories can result in violence. I can't look at January 6th and be like, oh, it's okay to spread these lies around. It's almost amazing that more people weren't killed on January 6th with the level of violence that happened. So I may take this a little bit differently. I think the regulation, when it comes to these kinds of things that can incite violence and can incite hatred that could result in violence, there should be something, regulating it. One thing I should note too that the EU has done, by the way, has tried to promote and legalize protection for victims so that victims have more resources, have more legal protections, which can fall under anti-Semitism. If someone is a victim of an anti-Semitic crime, the EU has kind of stepped in to give victims more rights. So that's something that actually the EU has kind of gotten involved in. And by the way, where the EU started getting involved in regulating the internet was child pornography. That's really like where they started, was protecting children. And I think, as we see now, there are other protections that need to be out there. And by the way, the DSA, to a certain extent, does protect children and put things so that things are not targeted to children that are specifically anti-Semitic. And another thing, by the way, speaking of monies that the EU is given, like they gave money it's like they're little cartoons, and it explains to kids who are not Jewish about like Jewish practices and Jewish holidays to kind of get out there, like what is Judaism, because people don't know what it is. So, you know, to kind of use the internet in a positive way, right, to try to get out more positive information. But I think maybe we have a different take on, you know, what should be regulated, what shouldn't be regulated. But I'm more fearful of the hateful, sort of violent, inspiring, you know, kinds of things that can be posted.
I think we are coming to an end of this really, really interesting discussion. People will see that I just put a link in the chat about our event. So for those of you who are in or close to London, please get your ticket for the Robert Fine Memorial Lecture, which will be in London on the 8th of December, where you can hear Karin Sturgner give the Robert Fine Memorial Lecture, and there will be a conversation between me and Hadley Freeman, and that should be kind of fun. So please follow that link and get your ticket and come with us and have a drink, and also see the awards of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism Book Prize, which is £1,000, and the Pete Newbon Award for the greatest contribution to the public understanding of anti-Semitism. So there's a plug for that, and I will just give you the link also for our next online seminar, which will be Eric Hines, who is a properly brilliant professor and really, really funny. So come and enjoy Eric. He's going to be talking about, quote, "Then the Jew must be merciful," an exploration of JDS, Jewish duress syndrome, with Eric Hines. Carolyn, I want to thank you really, really warmly. It was really a good introduction, I think, for everybody, and a really interesting survey of what the European Union does, and some really interesting kind of thinking and analysis about what we should make of it. So thank you very much. I will definitely come back to you and talk to you about Horizon, and perhaps rope you into our consortium, because we at the London Centre and perhaps a Goldsmiths would like to have a go at that. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.